A very warm welcome to everybody. In this episode, we will discuss the political ideas of a very distinguished British political thinker. His name is Jeremy Bentham, whose period is from 1748 to 1832. In the first place, we have to appreciate why we are discussing Jeremy Bentham, why he is so important. If you look at the history of Western political thought, then you will come across a term, you can call it a sort of concept, which is known as utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham is considered as the founder of or father of utilitarianism. Interestingly, utilitarianism is a very unique kind of phenomenon in the sense that it is a product of British political thought. And that way, it very specifically belongs to the British political tradition of which Jeremy Bentham was the founder. Now, utilitarianism, why it is so important? Important for the reason that if we look at the history of liberal political thought in England, then what we come across is, and I think you are already aware of it, that when one talks about liberalism, then a very standard understanding of liberalism is that it focuses on the importance of rights of the individual. And as you know perhaps, that it was John Locke who was the father of English liberalism, and he is considered as the father figure of English liberalism for the reason that it was he who for the first time came out with the doctrine of natural rights. That is, Locke believed in the autonomous existence of rights which are natural in the sense that man is born with these rights. These rights cannot be taken away by any external agency. These rights belong to man. Man cannot part with these rights. So liberalism is in a way inseparably associated with the doctrine of rights of the individual. Very interestingly, Jeremy Bentham, through his doctrine of utilitarianism, challenged this very idea of rights. So the utilitarian doctrine was a kind of counterpoint vis-a-vis the rights tradition. So this is a point which we have to keep in mind. That is, utilitarianism or the utilitarian tradition vis-a-vis the rights tradition. This is how, or this is the perspective in which we have to understand the political ideas of Jeremy Bentham. So we will now focus on the ideas of Jeremy Bentham with reference to his characterization of what he calls utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism, basically the way, say, Jeremy Bentham framed it, well, this actually is characterized by three very important elements. You can call them the characteristics, the salient features of utilitarianism as identified by Jeremy Bentham. The first characteristic is what Bentham calls felicific calculus. Now, what is meant by it? Bentham makes it very clear that rights which start off with the idea of certain, say, preconceived notion, that is, say, right to life, right to liberty, right to property, the importance of which just one cannot question, which is absolutely infallible, inalienable. Bentham does not believe in it. Bentham does not believe in any such preconceived notion of rights which are sacrosanct, which are uncompromising, which cannot be parted with. On the contrary, Bentham argues that we have to consider every action of an individual or government in terms of maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain, maximization of happiness and minimization of suffering. All those actions, all those policies are acceptable if they promote happiness and if they discourage pain. This is the first principle of Jeremy Bentham. Now, if you ask me that why do we call it utilitarianism, the answer is very simple. Maximization of pleasure means that any policy, any action is acceptable if it serves the cause of utility. That is, it is useful. Why it is useful and why it is useless? It is useful for the reason that it maximizes my happiness, and it is not useful. It is therefore it does not serve the cause of utility if it serves the cause of pain or suffering. So that is Bentham's very straightforward, clear-cut understanding. That is the first principle. The second characteristic of utilitarianism as identified by Bentham is this, that this is a very pertinent question. That is, Bentham is quite aware of it, aware of this point. That is, when we talk of, say, maximization of pleasure or happiness, then the point is, how do we measure it? How do we calculate it? There are so many people, so many individuals, so many types of people, so many types of groups. So it is absolutely unmanageable. So how can you think in terms of one common consideration of happiness or, say, suffering? Here again, Bentham's solution is very interesting. Bentham says, you just make an aggregate of pleasure or happiness. You just sum up. You just sum up, and thereby you arrive at an aggregation. And it is this aggregated understanding of pleasure. If it reaches a certain point, if you can arrive at the sum total or totality of pleasure, well, that gives you happiness. And if you say, that is after calculation, that the total quantum, the total aggregate of pleasure, that is more than the total quantum of suffering, then you have to accept it. If it is not, you do not accept it. So that is Bentham's second principle, or second characteristic of utilitarianism. The third characteristic of Bentham, that is sometimes known as consequentialism. And here actually Bentham makes it very clear where and how he differs in his defense of utilitarianism from the rights tradition. He says every policy, every action, whether it is political, whether it is social, whether it is moral, well, it has to be judged in terms of its consequence with reference to the idea of pleasure and pain. In other words, I have to judge an action or a policy or a program in terms of its consequences, in terms of results. If the consequence is happiness, I accept it. If the consequence is suffering, I do not accept it. This is Bentham's understanding. From these three criteria, or from these three characteristic features of utilitarianism, as Bentham explains it, what we deduce is somewhat revolutionary. Revolutionary in the sense, and there you find the difference with the rights tradition. In the rights tradition, you think in terms of individual rights, individual right to life, liberty, property, etc. But in Bentham's utilitarian understanding, the focus is on the collective. Focus is on the collective in the sense that Bentham makes it very clear that our consideration so far as endorsement of a policy or a program or a law is this. It is one simple, single consideration. Now, what is that consideration? The consideration is if it serves the interests of the larger number, and that is very famous principle of Bentham, greatest good of the greatest number. That is, if a policy or program or whatever be it, any action, any activity, if it serves the general welfare of society and does not or is not concerned with simply certain specific individual rights, because that is not Bentham's concern. In other words, if any program, any action, any policy is oriented towards promotion or cultivation of the general interests of society, then it is acceptable. That is, if it serves the cause of the collective utility of society, collective benefits of society, and therefore it maximizes the pleasure or happiness of the people. And if in doing so, or if in doing this exercise, it violates even individual rights, then this policy is acceptable. In other words, you can understand this is a kind of, perception which eventually prepared the ground for, say, defense of what we call today the welfare state. That is, if it is a clash between individual rights and the collective interests of society, and if the collective interests of society, they eventually lead to the promotion of general welfare, and if this, and since it serves the cause of general utility of the people, since it happens to serve the general happiness of the people, then it is not rights that is important, it is collective good that is more important. And moreover, we also have to keep it in mind that Bentham, in a way, in his understanding, did not make any distinction between, say, status of one person and status of another person. There is no distinction of status. Everybody is equal. The only consideration is whether a policy or program or activity or law, whatever be it, if it serves the general interests of happiness, then that is acceptable. So you can understand that this is a tradition which is fundamentally different from the tradition of rights. Now, this, however, while this is, of course, the general understanding of Bentham, so far as utilitarianism is concerned, utilitarian outlook is concerned, it has certain problems also. That is, utilitarian philosophy, yes, when it was developed by Bentham, it of course made immediately a very big impact on English society, in fact, on political thought, on social thought as a whole. But immediately thereafter, it also encountered a number of problems. Let us take a close look at these problems. Let us take a quick glance at these three problems. The first problem is, when Bentham talks about maximization of pleasure or happiness, then the problem is that he looks at this very term pleasure or happiness simply in terms of quantity. Now, the question is that is it possible to arrive at one single homogeneous aggregated understanding of happiness or pleasure? Many political theories, many commentators who have later, say, looked into Bentham's writings much more carefully, they point out this is an impossible proposition, because Bentham does not take into account the fact that human tastes differ. And since human tastes differ, so my perception of happiness will be different from your perception of happiness. And actually, actually this whole idea of pleasure and pain, the idea of happiness and suffering, it varies from person to person. In other words, this very perception of whether I am happy or not, whether I am suffering or not, that is conditioned by, ultimately that is conditioned by one factor, that is my experience, my very own personal experience. So my experience of, that is, I arrive at my understanding of happiness through my very own peculiar experience. And my experience will differ from your experience. So there cannot be one single homogeneous idea of happiness or suffering. This is the first problem. The second problem is that there are grades of happiness, there are grades of pleasure, there are grades of pain. In other words, the point which has been raised by many commentators later is this, that say I am a person who derived the idea of happiness or pleasure by, say, listening to a piece of music. Another person, say, develops his or her feeling of happiness by, say, simply going to a restaurant, or, say, by indulging in certain acts of, say, consumption. It may be consumption of food, it may be consumption of alcohol, it may be anything like that. Therefore, so far as this notion of happiness, this notion of pleasure, this notion of pain, this notion of suffering, these are concerned, well, there are grades. So the happiness, the feeling of happiness that I derive from listening from the act of listening to a piece of music is different from the notion of happiness that I derive by, say, taking food, by taking, say, a dish of biryani. So the two perceptions of happiness, they are qualitatively different. For Bentham, well, this very point, in fact, Bentham did not take into account. This is the second problem. And the third problem about relating to Bentham is this. This is a problem which has emerged in recent times, a very serious problem. And this point is now being raised by many commentators. In fact, this perhaps explains that why utilitarianism, which took off with a bang immediately after Bentham developed his ideas, but later utilitarianism somehow lost its appeal. And one explanation perhaps lies in this third problem, which I will now very briefly explain. The point is that imagine a situation where, say, in a country like India, for example, it is very important. Say, if in the interest of the majority, a policy or a program or a law, say, is adopted by the government, in the interest of the majority. In the interest of the majority means in the interest of the happiness or pleasure of the majority. Say, certain action has been taken, certain law has been framed, certain rules, certain principles have been adopted. It may so happen that this law, it promotes the pleasure or happiness of the majority, but at the cost of the minority, at the cost of the voice of the marginalized. So what happens to them? In other words, in the name of promotion of common good, in the name of promotion of happiness of the majority, if the minority suffers, if the voice of the minority is eclipsed, so what happens to them? Who takes care of the minority? So this is a kind of problem, this is the third problem, which we come across in Bentham. So Bentham, of course, Bentham's utilitarianism, it was a major breakthrough. There is no doubt about that. But you can understand it was also a kind of intervention which led to a series of problems. And you can also guess perhaps that these are problems which eventually are associated with the idea of democracy, particularly the last point. That is, if in the name of utilitarianism, it becomes the tyranny of the majority as against the voice of the minority, then this is a kind of doctrine which creates a series of problems. So Bentham's utilitarian philosophy, it was apparently a kind of philosophy, a kind of outlook, a kind of doctrine which created the ground for, say, the development of welfare state, development of, say, an interventionist state in the name of welfare, which in the 20th century became a very popular slogan throughout the world. But it also creates problems when we think in terms of the voice of the minority, etc., etc. Now, it is for this reason that John Stuart Mill, another a very distinguished, celebrated figure of English liberalism, British political thought of 19th century, John Stuart Mill, apparently he agreed with utilitarian doctrine. John Stuart Mill was a person who believed in the philosophy of utilitarianism, who defended utilitarianism, but he modified Bentham's utilitarianism in a very big way. But this finally raises one question. That is, what happens therefore to those who are defenders of rights? This remains in fact a problem. That is, those who are utilitarians, they call themselves philosophical radicals. Philosophical radicalism, that is the coinage which is associated with utilitarianism. Because if you compare utilitarianism with the rights tradition, then of course it was very radical. Because English liberalism, or for English liberalism, or for the English liberals, well, it was unthinkable to make any compromise on the issue of rights. Because rights, they give you a sense of permanent identity. I am born with a set of rights. Rights actually focus on the idea of autonomy. Rights are just inseparable from the identity of the individual. It is almost rights which constitute the individual. That is the typical liberal spirit. And English liberalism is grounded in this understanding. You know perhaps that Locke's very famous doctrine, well, it tried to put forward this idea, it tried to sanctify this idea, that my right to life, my right to liberty, my right to property, these are absolutely, they are just inalienable. They are natural rights, man is born with these rights, they cannot be taken away, they cannot be interfered with, so they are absolute. That way, if one looks at Bentham's utilitarianism was a major break with this rights tradition. It was a major challenge to the rights tradition, because it at one stroke dismisses the very concept of any such preconceived notion of certain rights which give an individual a sense of identity. So, as you can understand, John Stuart Mill was intelligent enough to understand that yes, Bentham's intervention was very important. It was a radical challenge to the rights tradition, but it had problems also. So Mill, as I said, I will explain it later, Mill actually modified a lot the understanding of Bentham. And if we look at 20th century, then a number of very distinguished political theorists, John Rawls, for example, Robert Nozick, for example, then Ronald Dworkin, for example, all of them have argued that how can we compromise on the issue of rights. So they do not see eye to eye with utilitarian understanding or utilitarian perception of society as Jeremy Bentham viewed them. So Bentham's idea of utilitarianism, it was a very big challenge, it was a major intervention, it was highly innovative, but it was also associated with a host of problems which later had to be modified by the successors of Bentham. Thank you.